You've done your part, but you don't fit into the life I'm building now.
The night Rhoda's marriage ended did not arrive with shouting or broken plates. It came with silence, cold and deliberate, the kind that creeps into a room and settles like dust no one intends to clean. Richard stood near the door, adjusting his cufflinks as though he were preparing for a business meeting instead of dismantling a decade of shared life. Behind him stood a woman, taller, polished, her perfume sharp and unfamiliar, watching Rhoda with a faint dismissive smile that carried more insult than words ever could. Rhoda's hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the quiet realization that something irreversible had already happened long before this moment. She looked around the house she had helped build from nothing, the walls she painted, the meals she cooked, the nights she stayed up awake balancing accounts when Richard's business nearly collapsed. None of it seemed to belong to her anymore. Richard cleared his throat, finally speaking with a calmness that felt rehearsed. "You've done your part, Rhoda," he said, almost kindly, "but you don't fit into the life I'm building now." The words landed heavier than any insult. Not anger, replacement. Not conflict, erasure. And just like that, 10 years of loyalty were reduced to something outdated. Welcome to the sweetest African folktale stories, where we bring to you the sweetest folktales to nourish your mind and soul. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications bell so we can grow together, sweet folks. Rhoda did not beg. That was what unsettled Richard the most. She simply stood there, absorbing every word like someone memorizing pain for future reference. The other woman, Sandra, stepped forward slightly, her heels clicking against the marble floor with quiet authority. "It's not personal," she added, although her tone suggested otherwise. "Some people are just meant for smaller lies." The sentence lingered in the air, sharp and intentional. Rhoda's gaze shifted slowly towards her, studying her, not with jealousy, but with a strange calm that neither of them could interpret. If anything, it made Sandra uncomfortable. Richard sighed, as though this entire situation was an inconvenience. He reached into his pocket, pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table. "This should help you settle modestly." Modest. The word echoed louder than the rest. Rhoda didn't touch the envelope immediately. Instead, she looked at Richard, not the man she married, but the version of him that success had reshaped into something colder, something unrecognizable. "Is that all I'm worth now?" she asked quietly. Richard didn't hesitate. "It's more than enough." And that was the moment something inside Rhoda shifted. Not shattered, not broken, but recalibrated. When Rhoda finally stepped out of the house, the night air felt different, heavier yet strangely freeing. She carried only a small bag, but what weighed more was the clarity settling in her mind. There would be no return, no reconciliation, no waiting for apologies that would never come. For a brief moment, doubt tried to creep in. Questions about survival, about where she would go, about how she would rebuild from nothing. But those thoughts didn't last, because beneath the humiliation, beneath the quiet betrayal, there was something else rising, something steady, something dangerous. Awareness. Rhoda had spent years learning, observing, managing, and quietly holding together the very business Richard now believed he built alone. She knew suppliers he had forgotten, understood margins he never noticed, and saw opportunities he had overlooked. He had mistaken her silence for limitation. That would be his most expensive mistake. As she walked down the dimly lit street, she didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because something far more powerful had taken its place. Purpose. And though she did not yet know how long it would take or how difficult the road ahead would be, one truth settled firmly within her. The version of her that walked out tonight would never be the same woman that walked in. Rhoda did not return to the city the next morning. Instead, she boarded a quiet, almost empty bus fading towards a place she had not called home in years, her father's old compound on the outskirts of a forgotten town. The journey was long, the road uneven, and every passing mile seemed to peel away the remnants of the life she once knew. By the time she arrived, dawn had begun to stretch across the sky, casting a pale gold light over the cracked earth and rusted rooftops. The house stood exactly as she remembered, aged, tired, but still standing, a reflection of survival without comfort. Her father, now slower in movement and quieter in speech, opened the door with a look that held both concern and understanding. He didn't ask questions immediately. He simply stepped aside and let her in. That silent acceptance broke something deeper than Richard's words ever could. But Rhoda did not collapse into grief. Instead, she observed everything. The neglected storage shed, the unused farmland, the women in the village walking miles to sell goods at unfair prices. Opportunity rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, waiting for someone who has nothing left to lose. The village operated on effort, not efficiency. Women worked tirelessly, yet remained trapped in cycles of small returns and constant exhaustion. Rhoda noticed patterns quickly. The lack of coordination, the poor pricing structures, the absence of collective bargaining. Each woman worked alone, and in that isolation, they were all being quietly exploited by middlemen who dictated prices without resistance. Rhoda didn't rush to change anything immediately. She spent days observing, listening, asking questions without revealing her full intent. Some of the women recognized her vaguely, remembering the quiet girl who once left for the city with hope in her eyes. Now she had returned, but different, calmer, sharper, almost unreadable. One evening, as she sat beneath a large tree watching a group of women argue over unfair payments, she realized something crucial. The problem wasn't lack of effort, it was lack of structure. And structure was something she understood deeply. For years, she had built systems for Richard's business, systems he never even knew existed. Now, for the first time, she would build something that carried only one name. Rhoda's proposal was simple, but it sounded radical to those who had never seen it work before. Instead of selling individually, the women would pool their goods, process together, transport together, and negotiate as a single unit. At first, they resisted. Trust was fragile in a place where survival often depended on self-preservation. But Rhoda didn't argue. She demonstrated. Using her own small savings, the very money Richard had dismissed as more than enough, she purchased raw materials and organized a small test batch. She streamlined the process, reduced waste, and calculated pricing based on real market value rather than what middlemen dictated. When the goods sold at nearly double the usual rate, the skepticism began to crack. Not fully, but enough. Change rarely comes through persuasion alone. It comes through proof. And Rhoda understood that if she wanted loyalty, she had to earn it, not demand it. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the collective began to take shape. What started as a small experiment grew into a structured operation. Rhoda assigned roles, not based on age or status, but on ability. Some handled processing, others logistics, others negotiation. For many of the women, it was the first time their work had been recognized as part of something larger than daily survival. But beyond the numbers and systems, something else was forming. Belief, not just in the business, but in themselves. Rhoda remained firm but fair, never raising her voice, yet never allowing disorder. Her leadership was quiet, controlled, and intentional. She didn't need to prove authority. It was evident in the results. And with each successful transaction, her reputation began to spread beyond the village. Traders who once ignored them now came seeking partnerships, not out of goodwill, but because they had no choice. Power had begun to shift subtly, but undeniably. By the end of the first year, people no longer referred to it as the women's group. It had become something else, something with weight, with presence. They called it Rhoda's Network at first, then simply the Collective. But in the markets beyond their region, a different name began to circulate, one spoken with a mix of respect and caution, the Silent Force. Because unlike other traders who boasted loudly, this operation moved strategically, efficiently, and without unnecessary attention. Prices stabilized, quality improved, profits grew, and at the center of it all was a woman who rarely spoke about her past, who never mentioned the life she left behind,
and who seemed
Richard
completely
dismissed it
uninterested in
outwardly,
recognition.
waving a hand
But
as if
success has a
brushing off
way of
dust.
attracting attention.
Every small
wanted or
operation
not.
looks
And
impressive
somewhere
from a
far
distance.
from the village,
Give it
in a
time,
city
it'll
filled with
collapse.
glass buildings and fragile
As the
egos,
meeting
a
ended,
man
he
named
found
Richard
himself
was about to hear a
repeating the
name
in
he
his
thought
mind,
he had erased.
unable to explain
Richard first
why
heard
it
the name during a
unsettled him
tense meeting
more than the
that had already
numbers
begun
ever
slipping
could.
out of his control. The
What
boardroom
Richard
was
refused
colder
to
than usual,
acknowledge,
but it
his
wasn't the
business
air
began to
conditioning.
feel.
It was the numbers
Contracts
projected on the screen.
slipped quietly out of
Declining
his
margins,
grasp.
broken
Suppliers
supply
he had
chains,
relied on
competitors
for years
tightening their grip.
started negotiating
One of his senior
differently,
managers
or not
hesitated
at
before
all.
speaking, flipping through
One
a
evening,
report as though delaying the
frustrated and already
inevitable.
short-tempered,
There's a
he
new
slammed the
supplier
report
network
onto his
disrupting
desk
pricing
as
across
Sandra
multiple
leaned
regions,
casually
he
against
said
the
carefully.
doorway, scrolling
Richard
through
barely
her
looked
phone.
up. There's always
"You're
someone new.
overreacting,"
They don't
she
last.
said without looking
The
up.
manager swallowed.
"Businesses fluctuate."
This one is different.
Richard exhaled
A brief
sharply.
silence followed.
"This
Then
isn't
another voice
fluctuation,
added,
this is
quieter but
erosion."
firmer. They are
Sandra
coordinated,
shrugged,
structured.
uninterested.
They are
"Then
undercutting
fix it.
us without
That's what
losing
you're good
profit."
at, right?
Richard leaned
The
back
words were
slowly,
careless, but
irritation
they struck
flickering across his
deeper than
face.
she intended.
"And the name?"
Because
he
for the
asked.
first time in years, Richard wasn't sure he could fix it. The systems that once ran smoothly now felt unstable, unpredictable, and worse, the solutions weren't obvious. Late into the night, as he reviewed numbers that refused to improve, he muttered under his breath, "Who are you?" It wasn't directed at any one person, but somewhere, instinctively, he knew there was someone behind the disruption. Someone intentional, someone patient, someone who understood the game well enough to dismantle it without being seen. While Richard's empire began to show visible strain, Rhoda's continued to grow, but never recklessly. She avoided unnecessary exposure, declining interviews, declining public recognition, and redirecting all attention back to the work. Inside her growing headquarters, a modest but efficient building far removed from the chaos of the city, she reviewed reports with quiet precision. One of her coordinators approached hesitantly. "We've received offers from larger distributors," he said. "They want exclusive rights." Rhoda didn't look up immediately. "And what do they offer in return?" "Control," he admitted. That made her pause. Slowly, she closed the file in front of her and leaned back. "Then they offer nothing." The coordinator nodded, though he didn't understand. Rhoda stood and walked towards the window, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "We didn't build this to be owned," she added quietly. "We built it to remain." Her voice carried no arrogance, only certainty. But beneath that calm exterior was something else. Memory. Not of pain alone, but of underestimation. And she had learned one truth from it. Power is most effective when it is not announced. The first real intersection between Rhoda and Richard didn't happen face to face. It happened through numbers neither of them could ignore. A major contract, one Richard had been certain of securing, was withdrawn at the last moment. His team scrambled for answers, but the response they received was brief and final. "We've chosen a more reliable partner." That word, reliable, echoed like an accusation. Furious, Richard demanded clarity. "Who replaced us?" he pressed. The reply came with quiet finality. "The Silent Force." This time, the name didn't just linger, it struck. Richard stood abruptly, pacing the room. "Set a meeting," he ordered. "I want to see who's behind this." But the response was immediate. "They don't take direct meetings." That was the moment frustration turned into something sharper. Not fear, but something close. "Everyone takes meetings," Richard said, his voice tightening. "Not them," came the reply. And for the first time, Richard realized he wasn't dealing with a competitor who needed him. He was dealing with one who didn't even acknowledge his existence. Late that night, long after Sandra had fallen asleep, Richard sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights without really seeing them. His mind drifted, not to strategy, not to numbers, but to something he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Rhoda. Not as she was at the end, but as she had been in the beginning. Quiet, observant, always present even when unnoticed.
He remembered how she used to sit across from him during late-night planning sessions, offering small suggestions he often ignored. At the time, it felt insignificant. Now it felt incomplete. He shook his head, dismissing the thought almost immediately. Irrelevant, he muttered. But the mind doesn't discard what it recognizes too easily. Because somewhere beneath his resistance, a question had begun to form, uninvited, persistent. What if I underestimated the wrong person? He stood abruptly, pushing the thought aside as irritation resurfaced. No, he said aloud, more firmly this time. This is business, nothing more. But even as he spoke, something unsettled remained, quiet, growing, and impossible to fully silence. Richard did not wait for permission this time. If the silent force refused meetings, he would force proximity another way. Using what influence he had left, he arranged to attend an industry summit where major suppliers and investors would be present, including, according to quiet reports, a representative from the network that had been dismantling his business piece by piece. The venue was polished, controlled, filled with conversations, layered with politeness and hidden agendas. Richard moved through the crowd with practiced confidence, but his eyes searched constantly. "You're looking for ghosts," one associate muttered beside him. Richard's response was sharp. "Ghosts don't take contracts." Hours passed, and just as frustration began to settle in, he noticed something unusual. Not a person, but a pattern. Conversations shifting subtly when a particular name was mentioned. A quiet respect, almost caution among seasoned investors. Finally, he intercepted one of them. "Who represents them?" he asked directly. The man hesitated, then replied, "You don't meet her. She decides if you're worth seeing." The word "her" lingered longer than expected. Richard's expression hardened. "And her name?" The man shook his head slightly. "That's the part you're not ready for." For the first time, curiosity began to mix with something deeper, unease. If business pressure had begun to crack Richard's composure, his personal life ensured it would not hold for long. Sandra's spending, once a minor irritation, had become reckless. Lavish purchases, social appearances, and investments driven more by image than sense. One evening, as another financial alert flashed across his screen, Richard confronted her directly. "Do you even understand what is happening?" he demanded. Sandra barely looked up from her reflection. "What's happening is you're losing your edge," she replied coolly, "and you're looking for someone to blame." The word struck harder than expected. "This isn't about blame, this is about survival." Sandra turned then, her expression sharpening. "Then maybe you're not as capable as you thought." Silence followed, but this time it wasn't controlled, it was volatile. For years, Richard had built an identity around control, precision, certainty. Now, in both business and home, those foundations were slipping. And the more they slipped, the more one uncomfortable truth began to surface. The version of stability he once dismissed had not been accidental. The truth did not arrive dramatically. It came quietly, buried in a report Richard almost overlooked. A detailed breakdown of competitor operations, compiled by a consultant desperate to justify his fees. Richard skimmed through it with minimal interest until a particular section caught his attention. Operational structure, supply chain efficiency, cost distribution models. His eyes narrowed as familiarity crept in, subtle at first, then undeniable. "These aren't just effective strategies, they're my systems," he muttered, or at least the systems he believed were his. He leaned forward, flipping pages faster now. Margin optimization formulas, distribution patterns, even the way negotiations were structured, it all felt disturbingly recognizable. "Where have they learned this?" he muttered, the consultant. The consultant hesitated. "We're still investigating." But Richard wasn't listening anymore, because suddenly fragments of memory began aligning. Late nights, quiet suggestions, overlooked corrections. Rhoda. Not as a thought this time, but as a realization, slow, heavy, and impossible to ignore. No, he said under his breath, shaking his head as if rejecting it could undo it.
Measured regret. You built something impressive, he said, but you lost control of it. Richard's jaw tightened. Temporary setbacks don't define collapse. The man nodded slowly. No, but patterns do. That word again. Patterns. The same patterns Rhoda had once seen, once managed, once quietly corrected without recognition. Now those patterns were turning against him, exposing weaknesses he had never fully understood. As Richard left the meeting, his phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from legal advisors, financial warnings, and urgent requests. The noise was overwhelming, but beneath it all was something far worse than chaos. It was inevitability. The final blow did not come as destruction, but as an option. A quiet, controlled proposal delivered through official channels. A private acquisition offer for what remained of Richard's company. Enough to settle debts, enough to avoid legal consequences, but not enough to preserve pride. He stared at the document for a long time, reading the terms over and over as if repetition might change them. "Who is the buyer?" he asked finally. The response was vague. A private investment group. That answer felt intentional, designed to reveal nothing. Richard leaned back, exhaustion finally visible in a way it hadn't been before. "Set the meeting," he said quietly. This time there was no arrogance, no resistance, just acceptance, because when survival becomes the priority, pride becomes negotiable. And though he didn't know it yet, the meeting he had just agreed to would not just determine the fate of his company, it would force him to confront something far more personal, something he had once dismissed as insignificant, something that had been waiting, not loudly, not urgently, but patiently. The building was everything Richard's life used to represent. Glass, steel, precision, and quiet authority. As he stepped inside, the polished floors reflected a version of him he barely recognized. Not the confident man who once commanded rooms, but someone worn down by a series of decisions that now felt irreversible. The receptionist greeted him with professional calm. She said, "You're expected," gesturing toward the elevator. No waiting, no delay. That alone unsettled him. As the elevator ascended, each passing floor felt heavier, as though he were being lifted not toward opportunity, but to something inevitable. When the doors finally opened, he was led down a corridor lined with minimalist design, clean, controlled, intentional. At the end stood a large door, slightly ajar. "Go in," the assistant said softly. Richard adjusted his jacket out of habit, though there was nothing left to fix. Then he stepped inside. The office was expansive, overlooking the city in a way that suggested ownership, not admiration. But what caught his attention wasn't the view. It was the chair behind the desk, turned slightly away, occupied but still. For a brief moment, everything felt suspended. Then the chair moved. Rhoda didn't rush the moment. She turned slowly, deliberately, allowing recognition to arrive at its own pace. The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, layered with everything that had once been said and everything that had not. Richard froze, not out of confusion, but out of realization. The kind that doesn't need explanation because it already understands too much. For a second, he said nothing, then, almost involuntarily, "Rhoda?" Her name on his lips sounded unfamiliar, as if it no longer belonged to him. She met his gaze evenly, her expression calm, composed, and entirely unreadable. "You asked for a meeting," she said, her voice steady. No anger, no bitterness, just clarity. Richard took a step forward, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one he had dismissed years ago. You, this is..." He stopped, unable to complete the sentence. Rhoda leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the desk. "The company you built," she finished for him. "Yes, I've reviewed it." The words were precise, acknowledging his effort, but not validating his ownership of the moment.
Richard exhaled slowly, the weight of understanding settling in. "The silent force," he said quietly. Rhoda didn't nod. She didn't need to. The truth was already clear. The conversation that followed was not dramatic. It was controlled, measured, almost surgical. Richard spoke carefully, choosing his words with a caution he had never needed before. "I didn't know," he admitted at one point, though even he wasn't sure what he meant by it. Rhoda listened, but she didn't interrupt. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment, not to create tension, but because she had nothing left to prove. "You knew enough," she said finally. The statement wasn't cruel. It was accurate. She reached for the document on the table and slid it toward him. "The terms remain the same," she added. "Your debts will be cleared. Your staff will be retained." Richard looked at the paper, then back at her. "And me?" he asked, quieter now. That was the only moment her expression shifted just slightly, just enough to reveal something human beneath the control. Not anger, not even satisfaction, just distance. "You'll have what you gave me," she said, "a chance to start again, with enough." The words settled between them, carrying a weight neither of them could ignore. Richard nodded slowly, understanding not just the outcome, but the symmetry of it. As he signed the document, the finality was clear, not just of a business, but of a chapter that could never be rewritten. When he stood to leave, he paused briefly. "You've changed," he said. Rhoda met his gaze one last time. "No," she replied softly. "I've always been this. You just never saw it." And as he walked out of the office, the city below remained the same. But for him, everything had shifted, not because he lost, but because too late, he finally understood. Thank you for watching, sweet folks. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out of our sweet and captivating stories we've in store for you on this channel. Also, tell us what you've learned and where you're watching from in the comment section. Your voice matters to us here. Stay and enjoy another stories on this channel. We remain the #1 sweetest African folktales. Love you, sweet folks.